Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to talk about Star Trek Discovery and its continuity problems with other Star Trek shows. And one of the biggest problems, and I mentioned that numerous times, is the fact that they keep showing us holograms, and I keep saying holograms shouldn't really exist in this time period. It was stated specifically by various characters in the other shows that holodeck technology did not exist in the 23rd century. However, that doesn't mean holograms did not exist. So maybe when they say holodeck, they refer specifically to the kinds of holograms which you can touch and feel and smell. So saying there were no holodecks doesn't necessarily mean there were no holograms of any kind. Now the biggest problem is that we didn't actually see any kind of holograms in the original show. So obviously it doesn't fit visually. I made all kinds of theories, suggestions to try to explain it. I said maybe all the holograms in Discovery are not even holograms. Maybe all the characters on the ship have small lenses in their eye, implanted in their eye, like small screens which enable them to see these so-called holograms. So a character without the device will not actually see anything. So this way we can kind of imagine maybe there were the same kind of holograms in the original series, but we as the audience simply didn't see it yet. And there were a lot of places in the original show. If you look closely, you'll see Spock, for example, looking inside the various devices, and you can see there is no actual screen there. There's just a lamp or something. So obviously it's a problem with the props themselves, that we're not supposed to see what's there when it first aired on small TV screens, many of them still black and white and so on. But today we clearly see in a few places that Spock is looking at something, but there's nothing there. So maybe he is seeing some kind of holographic image because he has an eye device that connects with it. And we've seen a lot of devices like that in the original show, which we didn't understand what they're for. But maybe we can imagine the characters actually do see all kinds of elaborate holograms, but simply we didn't see that because as if we didn't have the device yet. So that's one of my theories to try to explain it. And in the first episode of season 2, we did see something similar to what I suggested. We saw Stamets looking at a hologram of his dead lover, and then we hear Tilly calling him, and then he removes something from his head, and then that image disappears. And they even show us a close-up of his eye, and we see that image inside his eye. It was as if he was seeing things all around him, as if he was inside the recording. So maybe that's the way people see it when they project their hologram somewhere else. Maybe that's the way it's done. Because we always saw the way the holograms behave, they always saw what's going on around them. It's also possible it's some kind of synaptic device directly hooked into his brain. We've seen that in a Voyager episode called Equinox, in which another starship which didn't have holograms, its crew members were using devices like that for entertainment instead of the holodeck. So it was as if they directly hook up their brain to this kind of simulation, and the device itself looked very similar. So it's possible it's the same kind of device here that Stamets is using. But the fact that they showed us his eye and we see the image itself in the eye, that indicates to me that maybe it is indeed projected into the eye itself. We also saw something similar in the episode about the space whale in the previous season. We've seen a medical officer scanning the creature, and then we saw some flickering inside his eye, and he didn't seem to look down at any device when he was scanning that creature. And so I used that as evidence to say that they all actually have some kind of screens in their eyes, and that's also, in my theory, explains how they are able to see holograms. And some of the holograms might be personal, meaning only one person can see them. So I think if they actually gave us such an explanation in the show itself, it would solve this continuity problem. Now if that's not the case, if these are real holograms, then we have to come up with a different excuse to explain why we didn't see them in the original show. And one such excuse would be to say that maybe holograms got limited by Starfleet, maybe because they're a possible security risk, because as I said, anyone who projects himself as a hologram is able to see everything around him. And so let's say a hologram appears on the bridge, then that hologram will see everything that is happening on the bridge. And maybe enemy forces might be able to hack into such transmissions of holograms, and then they'll be able to scan the whole bridge and see all the little details, all the screens in the bridge. And that's very dangerous, as we've seen in the movie Generations, when the Dura sisters hacked into Geordi's visor and they were able to see the shield frequency of the Enterprise. That's what allowed them to destroy the Enterprise. So maybe holographic transmissions are a security risk, because maybe if someone hacks into such a transmission, he'll be able to see things on the ship he's not supposed to. And so I offered the theory that maybe Starfleet Command decided to tighten the security on all the starships, and one of the security measures is not to use holograms unnecessarily. Maybe there is a rec room in which it's allowed, but it's not allowed on the bridge, and maybe not even in the rooms of the crew because they might look at some computers in the room and so on. So maybe it was limited to specific rooms for either training or entertainment purposes, and was deliberately removed from all the rooms which have any access to any information which is classified. I made a similar excuse for why they started using real paper again in the original show. I suggested maybe it's a way to avoid getting hacked, because if you put it on physical paper and it's not hooked up to anything, then there is no way that anyone outside of the ship can possibly hack into it. But if it's on a pad, if it's on a computer or on a hologram, then maybe someone might be able to hack it from outside the ship. So I think if we get an actual explanation like that, that would be very cool and neat, and it will solve the continuity problem. So we could say the holographic technology did exist, but was imperfect and caused all kinds of problems like that, and that's why it was severely limited. And then it wouldn't annoy me as much to see all the holograms in Star Trek Discovery. And I don't think the writers and producers care about any of these details. They don't really care about continuity. That's one of the things that piss me off. But we can still use all these excuses for ourselves, for our own head canon. We can fix all these issues with explanations, and that will make it easier to accept all this stuff. It really annoyed me in the first episode of season 2 when they showed Michael's room, and we see a whole bunch of candles all over the room. And when the candles are activated, it doesn't look like it's a glitchy hologram. It looks totally real. So she basically has her own holodeck in the room. She cannot touch the holograms probably. I hope they won't show that, because that would really piss me off. So maybe when she blew out the candle and we see it move, it's all a simulation. It's not physical in any way. But still, it looks so perfect. The holograms look completely real until we find out it's a hologram, and it's all over the room, not in one place. And so basically that means that everybody on the ship have their own holodecks inside their rooms where they can do anything. And so that really doesn't compute, because all the episodes when some aliens invaded the ship and started shooting everyone, wouldn't it be really useful to be able to create holographic simulations in the corridors, for example, to confuse an enemy, to make him shoot at holograms instead of real people? And yet no one ever used that. In all of Star Trek, we never saw that being used as any kind of defense in an event of an invasion on the ship. And so that's why it doesn't really make sense if you think about it. Also, there was an episode in Star Trek TNG called The Rightful Heir, in which we see Worf lighting candles to do some kind of a ritual. And then Picard comes into his room and says, why don't you use the holodeck instead of setting fire in your quarters? And so that doesn't seem to fit, because if he can create holographic candles all over his apartment, then why would he need the holodeck for that? If he can actually do the simulation which looks perfect in his quarters, so why does Picard suggest to him to go to the holodeck? So you see what I mean, that it doesn't seem to fit the dialogue. On the other hand, there was another episode in which Barclay tried to meditate, and then at some point he gave up and he said end the program, and then we see the candle light disappears, but the candles themselves stay. So I guess it can be up to debate whether or not those candles were actually holographic, because they didn't disappear completely, they only turned off. So maybe the computer is simply able to extinguish the fire. Actually, this was said in another episode of TNG, that the computer can prevent fire on the ship by putting a force field around the flame, and then the fire extinguishes. So maybe that's what happened in this scene in which we see the candle suddenly turning off. And since they didn't disappear, I guess they are not holographic, even though I guess they could be. And in some episodes of TNG, we did see people using holograms in their rooms. We saw Riker watching some women on his desk, and we saw Tasha's hologram, and we did see a whole bunch of holograms over tables, but usually they were not perfect holograms. They did look kind of transparent, and so that's why I tend to think those candles were not holographic, and that's why they didn't disappear, and that's why Picard didn't suggest to Worf to simply use holographic candles in his room. Instead, he told him to go to the holodeck to create that ceremony in the holodeck. And yet in Star Trek Discovery, we see that it's possible to simulate a whole bunch of candles all around the room. And so that's why I still say it doesn't really fit, and you cannot use the excuse that this is a more advanced starships, because this is over a century apart. So you would think that a century later, if this was available, it would become available on all starships. And so I still say it doesn't really fit, and it's annoying. I wish they didn't do that. Now some people might bring out the animated show and say that they had a rec room which was basically a holodeck. Well, let's assume it is canon, but this was after the original series, and so we can assume it's brand new technology. That's why we didn't actually see anyone using that in the original series itself. No one ever mentioned that. And also, don't forget that when TNG started, everybody was so amazed to see the holodeck. It's as if it's a brand new thing. Now, it's possible they were simply amazed by the quality of the simulation, meaning they are not surprised by the existence of a holodeck. They are simply surprised at the quality of this specific holodeck or the programs themselves. I mean, even Pulaski was asked directly by LaForge, is this your first visit to a holodeck? And she said, only to one with this level of sophistication. So we can assume that holodecks did exist even before this one, but this one is simply so well done. And in another episode we see Picard praising the simulation of Dixon Hill, and he's telling the crew how amazed he was by all the sounds and smells in the program that made it all look so real. So again, we can assume that he's simply amazed at the quality of the program. So it's as if someone goes to see a very good movie and he tells his friends, I just saw the most amazing movie yesterday. So obviously he would be talking about the movie itself. He wouldn't really be praising the movie theater that he saw it in. He wouldn't really be talking about how good the screen was or how comfortable the seats were when he excitingly tells us about the great movie he just saw. He's talking specifically about the movie itself. So in this case with the holodeck, we can assume they are also amazed by the programs themselves. Maybe the programs are so well made, and that's what surprises them, and not the holodeck itself. But of course this is all an excuse. Of course this was not the intention. When you watch that show, it's obvious it was supposed to be brand new technology. Now Discovery is not the first show to mess up all its continuity, because even in Voyager there was a continuity mistake regarding the holodeck, because in one episode in which Naomi Wildman goes into a holodeck program, at some point her mother visits the holodeck and she meets the holographic characters, and then she talks with them as if she knows them from her childhood, as if she was playing this holodeck program herself as a kid. And Voyager started right after TNG, and then later in the same episode even Janeway says that when she was a little girl she also played this holodeck simulation. And that means it had to exist way before TNG started, many years before. And so that kind of confirms that the holodeck did exist before TNG, and that even civilians apparently were allowed to use it. So it wasn't limited to specific starships. And so that does retcon the beginning of TNG when everybody is amazed, and so the only way to explain that is to say that they are amazed at the quality and maybe at the programs themselves. It's as if you just played some new amazing computer game and then you tell all your friends, I just played on the computer, it was so detailed, I felt as if I'm inside the game, and if someone was listening to that conversation from the side, he might mistake it thinking that the person is praising his computer screen or his computer overall, as if he never saw a computer before. But if you do know the facts, then you know that he's only talking specifically about that specific game he was playing, and so we can use that same excuse to explain away the holodeck problem in the beginning of TNG by saying that it did exist before, it was simply not as elaborate. And of course we saw a kind of holodeck in the animated show, and so I can accept the idea that a slightly more primitive holodeck did exist in the time of the original series. I just wish that Discovery would show us that it is a more primitive version, because the way they showed it to us in that scene when Lorca and Tyler were playing in their holodeck, it looked totally real without any glitches, and so it looks to us just as good as the holodeck in TNG. If they simply showed it as a more primitive version of the holodeck, then I would have no issue with it. I would say, okay, that makes sense. When it was just the transmission, it was all glitchy and stuff, it wasn't such a big deal. But now they're showing us that they're able to make all these perfect holograms all over the room, basically turn their whole room into a mini holodeck, only that they can attach the holographic stuff. So that is kind of annoying because it doesn't make sense with all the examples they explained. And also with the tactical thing, that they cannot use it to confuse enemies if they board the ship. And so that's why I do find it kind of annoying, but if we get an explanation like I suggested, then I would be able to accept all of this. So I wish they actually do that. And one thing that all of this might actually explain is the fact that in TNG, whenever anyone went into the holodeck was always empty. And it was always kind of strange to me, because wouldn't everybody want to go into the holodeck because you can do anything there and so on? So how come the holodecks were always empty? But if we now assume retroactively that actually everybody had kind of mini holodecks in their rooms, anyone could do a lot of stuff without going to the actual holodeck, then maybe it could explain why no one bothered to go into the big holodeck. Maybe people didn't need to go that far. Maybe if they could create small holograms inside their private rooms, maybe it's better because, you know, privately you could do a lot more stuff. So actually, you know, this would explain a lot. This would explain why the big holodecks always remained empty, as if everybody are in their rooms playing with their small holograms. And we've seen Riker in one episode kind of looking at women, and he has kind of a kinky smile as if he's planning something, but then he gets called away and tells those women later. And again, we don't know how physical these holograms are in their rooms. They seem kind of transparent, so I guess you cannot actually touch them. But if you could, maybe you wouldn't ever leave your room. Maybe you could do anything you want in the privacy of your quarters. And then you wouldn't need to go into the big holodeck that often, only if you want to play with friends, if you want to go in a group to do stuff together, only then you'll go into the big holodeck. But if you want to do private stuff, then you can do it in your quarters. And I won't elaborate, you all know what I mean, but this would actually explain a lot. It would explain why the big holodecks always remained empty. So maybe this is all a good thing. You know, a lot of times mistakes force people to try to come up with theories to explain them, and then those theories become even more interesting on their own. And so maybe this is all a good thing, and this way we can invent all kinds of new stuff which we didn't think about before. So this is my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments below and we can discuss it. I hope you found this interesting, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.